Good evening, everybody, and welcome again. For those whose first lecture it is, welcome to the 68th Summer School. For those of you who have been before, it's been a long day, I'm sure, for some of you. So I'm going to be brief in my introduction of John. Sorry, I can't see without glasses. Sorry about that. Okay, John Matisson began political reporting at the Rand Daily Mail in 1974. He received a prison sentence for refusing to divulge his source of reports about the Muldergate scandal. You may remember that, and I didn't know that about you. He did this work while barred from the apartheid parliament throughout the apartheid era, as he was considered a security risk. He was a foreign correspondent in Washington for the Rand Daily Mail and in Johannesburg for National Public Radio. He has been published in the New York Times, Financial Times, Washington Post, The Observer, and many others, including all the major newspapers in South Africa. After 4 years as a broadcast regulator in the Mandela administration and 2 as editorial director of the short-lived This Day newspaper, he became the United Nations chairperson of the Electoral Media Commission in Afghanistan. He returned from a second tour in Afghanistan to write his first book in Franschhoek. His book, God, Spies and Lies, was published in 2015. He was appointed to the interim board of the SABC in 2017. So please welcome John Matisson. I'm sure you're going to be most interested.
Thanks very much.
If you want questions, will you just say if there are?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Okay. Happy to take questions. Yeah, thanks. That's audible? Good, thanks. When I was thanks very much. Welcome. Thanks for coming out and this late in the evening. When I was asked to do a talk here, we were in the middle of a particularly tricky moment at the SABC, but they all seem to be tricky. What you didn't end is I've been reappointed for 5 years, so the interim board has been expanded into the permanent board. That's of course a mixed blessing, but that's an oddity of the legislation, but that's how it works. So we are there. So we were 5, now we're 12 although we're down to 10 and they'll be advertising for a few more. But I have to say it's been, the good news has been that there have been, I have found myself working with people one could work with from very different backgrounds and so on. Before I start, I'm assuming I couldn't write this book now that I'm on the board. I couldn't be this frank in print. So I'm assuming there are no journalists here who are going to get me into trouble, because as a board, so I'm assuming it's off the record, no one will quote me. That seems to be fine, because as a board, we don't particularly look for publicity, but I did want to do this talk anyway, and that seems to be fine that I can. When I wrote this book and I gave talks, people said, are you less pessimistic than when you wrote the book? And I had to think, how pessimistic was the book? Because obviously I was determined to say how I really saw things, what I thought had really happened and got us to the point where we were under Jacob Zuma. And when I wrote the book, I was very critical of both Zuma and Mbeki, and I really wasn't sure what sort of reaction I would get. But the night of our launch in Cape Town, we went for dinner, a group of journalists, and that was the night of 9/12, Nenegate. And of course that changed everything, so I might like to think I pushed the wave of the fight against corruption a little bit, but I could sure surf it after that. And so I was pleasantly surprised that the mood in the country has really changed very much. We tend to forget that 2 years ago there were still many people who got very cross if you criticized Jacob Zuma or said that things were seriously corrupt. So my my talk tonight is actually fairly optimistic, but I'm not going to leave you the optimism without first imposing a little bit of the pain that I experienced in the SABC on you, and give you a little pessimism first, but it's because to give you a sense of how we got to where we are and what it's really been like. Now, one of the reasons why perhaps you're here is because the SABC is the first institution the government and Parliament has set out to change. And what I found striking when I was doing my writing is that, in fact, broadcasting was the first thing to change in 1994 as well. It actually changed before Mandela took office and I took office as a broadcast regulator about 10 days before President Mandela did in '94. And that's exactly what's happened now. And as you can probably tell, the plan is that if we get SABC right, the process has started with Eskom. You know, there's exactly the same process of an ad hoc parliamentary committee investigating corruption in Eskom, which will lead to decisions. In our case, it was to fire the old board, bring in a new board, and clean up and be held accountable. And I have to say the positive thing has been Parliament. Parliament has been very tough on corruption and supportive of us in both pressuring us to keep fighting corruption and supporting us when we do. So that's been the good news. On the other side, which is, now you'll see why I don't particularly want to be quoted, there's the thing called the EA. When you're in government, they talk about the EA. The EA is the executive authority. And you can gather who they are. And they are on the other side. So you actually sit in Parliament, in parliamentary committee hearings, where parliamentarians are in the ANC and the other parties are supporting you. And the minister is putting spanners in the wheels quite insistently. So to give you an idea, I'd been out of government since 1998 because I'd been a whistleblower against corruption in that time. And suddenly I was appointed to this. It's still not 100% clear to me who did it, but it seems pretty likely that there were some people in the ANC who read my book and actually thought about me when they were picking this new board. And so the board was chosen by Parliament. Parliament sends the name to the President. At this point, the way they'd handled it, the President had no flexibility about who he chose. So he had to confirm the appointment of the 5 names given to him by the Parliament. And the Parliament had, under the legislation, he had a certain period to appoint us. So there was no board. The company was in severe stress, and he didn't appoint. So I called an ANC friend of mine and said, when's he going to do it? He looked at the legislation. He said, the last day is Sunday night. He'll do it Sunday night. I said, do you have any inside knowledge? He said, no, none at all. I just know Zuma. He'll do it, wait to the very last minute, regardless of the impact on the corporation. That's what happened. I was watching TV at 7:15 on the Sunday night, and we got appointed. But that didn't mean we were allowed into the building, the SABC. The SABC leadership didn't accept our appointment, and nor did the minister. And so Parliament had some meetings in the SABC, and they invited us. So we, as the new board of the SABC, could only get through the door brought by MPs. There was a first meeting, then there was a second meeting, and at this second meeting, we were brought into an auditorium like this one in the SABC to be introduced to the staff as the new board of the SABC. And the chairman of the parliamentary committee on communications started introducing to us, and we'd each stand up and get applauded. And as they got to my name, I got a tap on my shoulder. Someone handed me a letter from the minister saying, "Dear Mr. Matisson, you hereby required not to take up your appointment as a member of the SABC board." That was still under Faith Mutambi. We've had 3 ministers in 9 months. which of course, as you know, is devastating to good governance, because they each start with no background in the area and so on. So I was still felt an outsider, and I thought, well, I'm not going to lend my name to the charade. And I said to my one colleague, I'm going to say what the letter says. And he shrugged and said, okay. So I stood up and I said, well, thank you very much for the applause. I'm afraid I have to tell you, I've just got a letter saying none of us are on this board at all. And then two very weird things happened. The first one was I must have spoken very fast, and a lot of people who weren't necessarily used to my accent, most people didn't understand what I'd said, so it was sort of wasted. The second was one ANC MP came up to me, and he was livid with rage at me, and he said, we're leaders, we'll resolve this privately, don't say it in public. And I must say, we've still since made friends, the MP and I, and we've sort of found each other, because they did, in fact, work hard to resolve it in a genuine way. And the new minister that was then appointed, that, by the way, was the Thursday that Pravin was fired. We were formally appointed by the minister the same day that the same day that Pravin was fired and the cabinet reshuffle happened. We got a new minister, but we were also approved to start. And then we, by the way, when we got up to the boardroom for that first meeting, there were 11 guards outside the door. So the securitization in the SABC, as other places, is quite excessive and extraordinary, and you would think might be a little money might have been saved on that, given that there was this little financial problem. But of course, the financial problem wasn't admitted. In our first meetings with the executives, I specifically said, does the SABC, is it in financial stress? They said, absolutely not. I said, are there any bills that are due that are unpaid? Absolutely not. My second meeting, the same thing, said by someone who is a registered CA accountant in the South African Institute. Of course, it turns out that things were so bad, and this is, in a way, on my way over here, people were being interviewed on the radio about Eskom, and I think you'll find some of the similar things in all the institutions. I was put on the Audit and Risk Committee, and I was on the board, and I kept asking for financials. They weren't naturally provided. Here's a company that's just would turn out to have lost R1 billion, a company that has no reason not to be profitable. The SABC really is able to set its own profit because it decides how much public service broadcasting to do and how much to do that is profitable. So it should be able to manage always to be in profit. And when it's been well managed, it's always been in profit. And so I asked for the financials. They weren't provided. We didn't come to meetings and get them. So I said to the acting CEO, so you had a risk committee, and I'm new, I'd never been on a risk committee before. He said yes. I said, did it function? He said, yes, perfectly. So it warned you of the risks? He said, yes, sure, of course it did. So I said, it warned you that the risk was this company was going insolvent, the curve had gone like this, and then it was going straight down. You're going to be in massive debt and you wouldn't be able to pay your bills. He said, no, it warned us that the risk was that Treasury wouldn't come in with money. So I said, and I'm really just using common sense here, I said, that's like saying the risk of me not paying my rent next month is that an uncle I've never heard of will die and leave me his estate. And he pushed back very hard. He said, no, you don't understand, John. Treasury must fund us. We are a public entity. Ministers demand services and public give us a public mandate. They call us up and tell us to do things. Treasury must come in with money. And that mentality, by the way, still endures throughout the organization. So much so that, we get hit. I was just telling a friend, Chris here, that we get hit from all sides all the time. Last month in December, the unions went on strike, and they said they weren't going to cover the conference, the ANC conference. The screens would go dark. And we said, but how can we give you an increase? There's no money. And they said, no, you must go to Treasury. SAA got money from Treasury. We must get money from Treasury as well. So that was the mentality, really, very much. And so I went and talked to a friend, very senior in Treasury, and I said, this is extraordinary. I've never seen anything like this. Isn't it astonishing? He said, no, it's typical, and yours isn't the worst. So I know it's a backhanded way to come to optimism, but what I've concluded, and I'll start to give you some figures of what we've achieved in the time we've been there, is that many of these people have gone into a mode. Pravin Gordhan talks about connecting the dots, and the corruption is so rife that they have that. And when an accountant stops giving you financials, it strongly suggests that he knows very well this cannot go on, and they will be caught at some point, and there is a lot of backhander theft going on, and they assume that at some point it will stop, and people have lost control of just taking money as long as they can. So what we did achieve is, this is just to give you an idea, we took over in April. We lost something like 200 million in April, 70 million in May, 35 million in June. By October, year-to-date October, in the previous year, under Hladi Motsoeneng and those people, we lost 400 million. In our term, we lost 3 million. In other words, we broke even. And if you consider that the first 3 months we didn't really have control of, you could actually say that for the first 6 months we would have made money. And I have to say that this is without doing anything creative. I mean, my background is broadcasting. I was a broadcaster in America. The exciting part for me is talking about new programming, getting stuff from America, Russia, Britain, so on, South African innovative programming. We didn't do any of that. It was entirely done in the negative, just by tearing up contracts and stopping substantial amounts of the theft. Not all of it, I'm sure. I should say immediately that I haven't seen the figures. I'll see them when I go back to Johannesburg next week. For December, January, and February are the worst months. So we will be in the negative again. And so for the year, I'm not guaranteeing we'll break even. I'm sure we'll lose a little. But we've stabilized. And for next year on the same terrain, we'll be back in the black, I would think. Now, we have a debt overhang. We've asked Treasury for a guarantee. We've had no real clarity on their attitude. It's very hard to get clarity of them saying, no, we won't give it to you for this reason. You just don't get the clear answer, or you get contradictory answers. But we're working on the basis that we want to be able to survive even if we don't get it, although obviously it would be helpful if we do. So that's one of the reasons I think that our economy is extremely resilient, and that I don't know if this is also true of Eskom, because the Eskom numbers are so large, 250 billion in guarantees and so on. I don't know. I don't have an answer to whether they can fix as relatively easily as we think we can. But I do think that there is resilience. And the other thing that's given me optimism was we've been interviewing for new staff. You may have seen a report in the papers, which I don't want to say too much about today because it's become very controversial. It was announced one of our top executive appointments, which, according to today's news, the minister is disputing our right to have made this appointment. So it's another headache, and we've got all the legal clarity on our side, but I'm still not sure how it'll end. But what we did find, I sat in on a lot of interviews in Johannesburg with young black professionals And I was extremely impressed with a new generation of black South Africans who have the requisite professional training and, every bit as important, quiz us to make sure that we're going to retain our integrity before they choose to join. So I think there is real reason for optimism. Of course, we know there's a shortage of the right skills we need. There are all the other problems. But I have been very heartened, and I feel more positive than ever that if, the big problem is the political will, but if there's the political will, this can be fixed. So since those figures, what we've been working on is how to grow the revenue. And I maintain in the boardroom that there is money lying on the floor in the SABC waiting to be picked up. And I'll give you just the most simple example. Do you know that the SABC's Zulu radio station is one of the biggest in the world? 7 million listeners, Ukhozi FM. Umhlobo Weneni, the Xhosa station, is about 4 million. There is a crying demand for merchandise, for T-shirts and things like that. We had never, ever signed a deal to merchandise our brands. I mean, this is not the sort of thing I've spent my life being involved in, but it's really just requires no particular thought. We've signed our first 3 contracts for 50 million, and there's no risk. Our contract is with merchandising companies. All we give them is our brand. We put down no money. We get 50, something like 50-50 back on their profits. So that's just the first 50 million that we weren't collecting before. There have been other major things like that. Our internet service, we have quite a big internet footprint, but the most awful, technologically awful platforms. We've had a contract to upgrade our websites. It turned out to have been corrupt. Money was paid in advance, and the work was never done. So we've spent months trying to work out, can we get anything out of the money we paid, and we basically scrapped it. We're starting from scratch again. There's also a syndrome which is common in government institutions, that they always want the Rolls-Royce of technology. And of course, it's quite common that boards, and I'd include myself in this, don't necessarily know enough to say, no, we don't need the Rolls-Royce of that. All we need is the minimum. So we're now going to be starting some things like, some things that really are the minimum, and cancelling those contracts too. So that's the story of the SABC. I'm not just wondering how much I should say about it. We're in a current this problem we have now. What happened was last month, in the last 2 months, the courts took a decision on. In fact, it was the same day as the cabinet reshuffle, and therefore was not noticed by the press. The Save Our SABC and Media Monitoring Africa, which are these NGOs that fight for press freedom and an independent SABC, had taken the government to court and won a really important case, which said that our board is independent and its decisions have to be taken independently. And this is key because legislation has been developed, as well as various agreements between government and the SABC over the last 10 years, since actually the Mbeki era, that have steadily encroached on the SABC's independence, which was supposed to be pristine in 1994. And one of the particular things which relates to the news of today was that executives had to be approved by the minister. So our top 3 executives, CEO, COO, and CFO, must be approved by the minister. Well, of course, that's how we got Cloudy. What's her name? And that's, of course, a very serious problem, because independence stands or falls right there. Well, a judge by the name of Motajani in Gauteng wrote the superb judgment, which he read on the day of the Pravin reshuffle, Pravin Gordhan reshuffle, which said that SABC's independence is vital to our democracy. So he really just put it in terrific terms. This is fundamental to the Constitution. The constitutional requirement for democracy requires an independent public broadcaster. That means the board must be independent. That means the board must not have to run its appointments by the minister. So a week later or so, we have a new minister again, the third minister in then was 6 months or so, 7 months. And we're called to Parliament to account in the Communications Committee, and the minister sitting in the front and having us sit behind her. And she announces that she's appealing the judgment. Now, I have to say we did know a few days earlier from her that she was going to do this, but we didn't expect her to announce it then. Now, the legal position is once you appeal the judgment, it's frozen, so we're no longer independent until it's settled. But the applicants, the Save Our SABC and Media Monitoring, immediately went to court for a declaratory order, it's got another name, but this will do for the moment, which says that while this decision is being undertaken, while the appeal is underway, we should have our independence. We then intervened as the SABC board, and we reached an agreement with the minister on a draft court order, which we agreed and signed, and then the judge made it an order of court to say we retain independence on the following terms: that we can, we must consult with the minister, but consultation is in the strict terms of the particular judgment by former Chief Justice Chaskelson, which means we must tell the minister, we must discuss with the minister, we must take account of her views, and then we're free to do what we like. And she has no veto. So that's what was signed in December. And if you'll see in tomorrow's papers, I'm sure, and it's on the net tonight, that the minister there was a leak of our first big appointment under these terms, very important appointment of the chief operating officer, was announced in the Sunday World yesterday, as picked up on the net and in the papers today, and the minister's put out a statement, and President Zuma's put out a statement saying they know nothing about it. Any such appointment must go to the cabinet and be approved by the minister and cabinet. So we're saying, obviously I don't want on the record, but we're saying, haven't you read the draft order? The draft order is, the court order. The court order is absolutely clear. So these things go on, there's never a simple outcome. So I think that's enough on the SABC for the moment. I do think that you'll find with many of the SOEs the same sort of situation prevails. The fact that it's so bad in a way is good, because it means if you put honest people, which is obviously a big if, but if Cyril Ramaphosa has the will to do it and the authority, the cleanup can be fairly quick. And I know that there are people around Ramaphosa who are saying they think they can get junk status reversed in 18 months. And from my experience, that seems to me plausible. So now I thought just for the rest of the talk I would go on to speak a little bit about where we are now in the light of the last week. And so obviously this is a bit speculative. And I wanted to sort of ask the question, who is Cyril Ramaphosa? I've known him a long time. And what and how will he make his changes? And the first thing I want to say about Cyril is he's seen himself as defined by what happened to him in 1991 in Durban at the ANC's first conference legally back at home. I was there, where he was elected Secretary General, beating Alfred Nzo, the candidate of the Exiles. And I've always thought that the relation between the split between internals and exiles was extremely important. And he won. He had so much support. He was seen as the next president, as a coming president. But in his own view, he was very, very bloodied by the experience because Thabo Mbeki never forgave him, never let him forget it. And others, constantly undermined him afterwards and said that, and sort of made him feel that he was not quite legit ANC, because legit ANC meant the exiles and the old groups. He's obviously been damaged by Marikana, and we can discuss that if necessary. But I still think, and so that's obviously taken some of the shine off him, because from what I know from the people involved in the Marikana Commission hearing, he wasn't guilty of causing anything, but his crime was one of omission, and it was a serious one, according to them. That, as someone who'd been president of the Mine Workers Union and someone who was on the board of Lonmin and a massive shareholder, one would have assumed that he would have driven through and seen the conditions of mine workers and kept in touch with these deteriorating situations. And the evidence apparently was mainly about his absence, which, one would have not expected from someone in his situation. Nevertheless, especially someone who was hoping to be president. Nevertheless, for me, the fact that he was a lawyer, a constitutionalist, the father of the Constitution, proud of the Constitution, and an internal person, put him in a different culture from the exiles who'd been, I think Barney Mthombothi had a good article yesterday in the Sunday Times talking about the hard experiences of the exiles, but it made them very hardened and very intolerant. And maybe there are other reasons for their hardness and intolerance, but that's irrelevant to this discussion. And the UDF internally had a culture of a much greater democratic manner of functioning. And for all these years, there have been many who felt that it was a mistake, or at least, as Barney put it rather well, I thought, that UDF closed down. UDF was the sort of internal ANC. It represented over 600 different organizations. It was national. It worked in a very democratic fashion. The unions were a big part of it, and they had a very democratic tradition at that stage, which I think they've to some extent lost. And it closed down for the obvious reason that people felt the apartheid government had always tried to divide the ANC. Or its opposition. And so they'd always said, our leaders are in prison and in exile, we're not the leaders, we're just here as surrogates, and they closed down. But Barney made the point well, I thought, yesterday, in saying that it's rather unfortunate that even if they were going to close down, they didn't have a meeting first as equals and say to the exiles and the prison parts of the ANC, these are the things we've learned about how to function above ground in South Africa, and in South Africa in whatever form, and you should take them seriously. And of course, the very extreme version of that, and this is why Zimbabwe, I think, is fundamentally different. ZANLA and ZANU in Zimbabwe really have been interlinked in a very tight way all these years. And so ZANU never had the traditions of democratic traditions that we've had in South Africa, and that's why what you've seen in these last months in Zimbabwe is effectively almost an amalgamation of the army and the party, and that's disturbing. But I'll come back to Zimbabwe a little bit in a moment. The other difference was that I always thought, I trained Mandela and Mbeki and the others for TV and radio in '91, and spent some time with them. And, Mbeki was trained in Leninist organization at the Lenin Institute in Moscow and in economics at Sussex. And I think that explains quite a lot about how he operated. But one of the things about it that strikes me, and you may want to quiz me about this, but is that that political culture was always big bore. They always dealt with macro political issues. And when he came back, he looked at the economy in a macro way. He looked at the total position, and he took a more conservative position. Cyril is much more micro, which I think is much more important. If you're going to fix South Africa, you're going to have to fix it sector by sector. And so I was encouraged when he said on Saturday, first of all, words matter to him. He reads a lot of books, and he thinks, and he's open to growing. And, his experience, I covered the mine workers' strike that he led in the late 80s. And of course, it was sort of a political victory in the sense that it built his stature considerably. But they actually lost in the short term, but much more in the long term. As wages went up, the number of mine workers plummeted. And so when he had that strike, it was the biggest union in the country. Now the mine workers union has shrunk and shrunk as there's been less and less investment and more mechanization. And of course, he better than most people understands the specific reason for the decline in mining, which is that policy uncertainty. While the mine owners have a lot of reservations about a lot of policy, the most important is that you have to negotiate a deal, and whatever deal it is, even if it's a fairly tough one, you have to be able to say, I understand that you're now going to put billions of rands into a hole in the ground and get nothing out for 5 or 10 or 15 years. Therefore, we've got to give you policy certainty. And I think that's an example of where he was being very specific, and I believe he meant it. Of course, time will tell if I'm right. So what he did, if you followed what he did, he's adopted them, and his first moves in KwaZulu-Natal, going and paying homage to the king, to the Lutuli, the other Zulu leaders of the ANC, and then requiring Jacob Zuma to come to the birthday bash in hostile territory for him, in Cyril's territory and not Zuma's, which was East London. And then, unlike Zuma, Mandela-like stopping the booing when Zuma was booed. Zuma allowed people to be booed when he was in charge. Cyril, like Mandela, said, we will not be factional. So I think the line, what strikes me, I don't know if you saw the interview he did last night, enormous confidence. He's able to, he feels confident that he's able to handle anything. And of course, the three toughest things that came out of the ANC conference, which had a lot of people in it, were, number one, he said that, the conference concluded that there must be confiscation of land. Of course, that's disturbed lots of people. The second was that everybody must get free education. And the third was that the Reserve Bank must be nationalized. Now, these are all big things that potentially could be very destabilizing to the economy. And he's handled them with great confidence. And I think, and I can't prove this, but I think time will prove me right about this, he's already worked out what he's going to do. On the Reserve Bank nationalization actually means nothing, the way it will be done. Because I met someone who was a Reserve Bank shareholder. It has no power, it doesn't affect anything. The Reserve Bank's governed by legislation. So he can say that the ownership is now changing, but I don't see the mandate of the Reserve Bank or its independence changing at all under Cyril. So I think, and obviously I'm projecting here, but from everything I know about him and the people around him, they understand that, Reserve Bank nationalization sounds sexy, but it means nothing, so we can do it quite enthusiastically. Secondly, land redistribution. Unlike many people in the ANC leadership, he knows that the Constitution allows for that already. The Constitution says nothing about a willing buyer, willing seller. It's not in the Constitution. It says nothing about confiscation market rates. What it actually says, and people forget this a lot, is especially a lot of activists, what it actually says is that any law can be passed as long as it has general application. In other words, you can't pass a law that says I'm giving Jacob Zuma so much, a particular piece of land. You can confiscate land, but it's got to be based on the historic use, the current ownership, prior ownership, how it was acquired, what it's needed for, and the payment for it is determined on those sort of criteria. The reality is that, as most land experts that I've spoken to say, is that very little has been done along those lines. Cyril knows, because he's in the weeds with the micro stuff and has lived here all his life, unlike his two predecessors, he knows that in fact the government has an enormous amount of land that's unused. So he can start there, and he's already said he's going to do that. And he's also put in enough caveats to drive a truck through, saying that nothing will be done that hurts food security and is financially unsustainable. And he also announced immediately that they're doing an audit of land that's already been transferred to find out how much of it is unused, is it not being utilized. So, and on the fees, he's found, I haven't looked into this, the nuts and bolts of this, but he's said that fees will be expanded progressively over time as they can afford it, and they'll start with free fees for people families earning under $350,000 a year. And so I think, I found him remarkably confident, and I think there is some grounds for it, that he can maneuver that. So much, I know quite a lot of analysts argue that personalities don't matter. And I think we're in a time when that's hardly a tenable position. When Mandela took views on Zimbabwe, for instance, very critical of Mugabe, the whole parliament of the ANC supported him. Thabo Mbeki came and reversed that policy, and most of parliament supported him. So I think, and AIDS, of course, Mbeki got tremendous success for a long time. So I think if Cyril takes these positions and implements them, he'll have a lot of support because you want to work with the president for a whole set of reasons. So how's he going to deal with Jacob Zuma, the elephant in the room? I think that what I've seen him doing in the last few days already, and you've obviously been able to watch the same things, he's first of all done the Mandela thing. He's said, we want unity and I won't be factional. Secondly, and we want Zuma to have his dignity, but secondly, he's saying we're going to do everything strictly by the book. I heard on my way in here, because I drive in from Franschhoek, that there's been an announcement that the Guptas, 1.5 billion of their property is going to be not confiscated, but it was going to be forfeited tomorrow. So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, but you were already seeing things happening. I think he'll keep tightening once he's established that the Tuli House is the center of power. They're making the decisions, and Zuma has to operate by them. If he violates any of them, then the NEC will be under strong pressure to remove him. If he cooperates with them, he gets himself into more and more trouble. And I've no idea how long it'll take, but everything points to the fact that that's the process, and however long it takes, it'll take. And it doesn't look like he's got too much going for him left. So the last thing I want to say before I stop is that, however time, on the economy, there's mining we've discussed. Manufacturing, he's got some options on. South Africa must. The question I ask, and I don't have time to explain this properly, but too well, is why did South Africa's economy, even in the good years under Mbeki, not grow as fast as any of our other BRICS member countries? And I have three main responses. One, South Africa missed the information boom. And I talk about that more in the chapter of the book, that it had to do basically with political interference by Mbeki. That could have been turned around, and the studies show that would have been worth 1.5% in growth. The second was the resource boom. We entirely missed the resource boom. Our company started building mines in Chile and Russia and all over the world, but here. And the third point I've always raised is how that Zimbabwe's economy cut in half, and it was our biggest African trading partner. Now, on all of those things, I think Cyril understands them, and on Zimbabwe, you know, the new regime is not exactly attractive, but they are much more economically realistic. And I think that Cyril's foreign policy is going to be, as an internal, is going to be much more focused on South Africa's direct national interest than was Mbeki's or even Zuma's, who had this notion of the UN and the AU being the most important thing, work through the multilaterals, grow our status in the multilaterals, in the UN, the AU, and so on. I once had this conversation with Trevor Manuel when he was Minister of Finance, and he was talking about changing the IMF and the World Bank, and I lived in Washington. And I said, Trevor, that's never going to happen. Do you honestly think the United States is going to give up control of the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, even through the Security Council? And it was surprisingly easy to get him to admit, yeah, no, it's not going to happen. I think Cyril understands that much better, and he'll focus on what really matters. What matters is Zimbabwe. We now have growth coming in Kenya and Tanzania and some other places, Mozambique. These are the economies that matter, and as we focus on them, I think it was no accident that he had the president of Kenya here. So what does this mean for... So I can see, if he turns around economic growth and creates jobs, I can see his political star of him and the ANC rising between now and the next elections. Now, of course, a long time between now and the next elections, things could fall apart. The ANC could split still. But my preliminary view right now, and maybe it's jaundiced by the fact that the DA is in trouble right now, particularly bad trouble here in Cape Town right now, is that Cyril is likely to bring the party together steadily and forcefully. He'll find ways to give the people he needs to something to keep them busy. And by 2019, he will be in a good position. If Jacob Zuma goes down, you won't see Cyril in front of the television putting him down. But I think the DA is going to be in a more difficult position. It's not at all hard to see Cyril, who was, after all, in the UDF with Musia Lekota, bringing Cope back into the ANC, strengthening his ties with the COSATU in the Communist Party, which he's always had an affinity for, if not ideologically, but personally. And actually doing rather well in the election in 2019. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. I beg your pardon?
How far down the road is Ramaphosa
in firing Zuma?
Is it close or 6 months away?
You know, one really is guessing. I think he's close. I think the fact that Sean Abrams' people are suddenly starting to remember that there were Guptas in their files is interesting. I was just thinking on the way here, could this be, in fact, not the year of Oliver Tambo or the year of Mandela, but the year of prison? I think it's fairly close. Yes, I mean, look at him. I know this is criminology, but did you look at his face the last few days, to being brought to the Eastern Cape and humiliated in public, and have Cyril have to and show what a gentleman he was in defending him. He's very weak, and Cyril has admitted that he's had I think at least 2 meetings one-on-one with him, where he's been talking through with him, and he's holding his feet to the fire because he's doing it through the system. He's applying the due process of the ANC. I would say it's fairly close. You know, this is the million-dollar question we'd all want to know. I suspect it's pretty close, but I really don't know. It could take longer, and I think part of it is what else is going on. I think Cyril wants it to happen, the product to come from somewhere else. You know, either the judicial system. What they can do and what they will do is they've instructed him not to appeal these court actions he's appealing. So if he continues to do it, he's violating ANC policy, he can be taken out. If he doesn't do it, then the court action is implemented. So I don't see that he can follow. I think that's the nub of the problem for Zuma now. And I think it's fairly close.
To what extent will the 783 corruption charges that is important take care of Zuma?
I think... Yes. Yes. Exactly. I do think it's going to be, the law is going to be a part of it, whether it's that case or one of the others, but probably that case. That will be the impetus that can be used to get him out. If he's charged, they can say, well, how can the country wait? And I do think, although he still has his enemies in the ANC, the people, you know, there were only 2 ministers in Kandla this New Year's bash, whereas apparently last year there were many, many more. People shift power. He's a lame duck. Whether he's out now or in a year's time, he cannot offer political protection to people anymore. But I do think the legal is definitely part of the stranglehold. Yeah. Yes.
How many people, have people been charged in prison? What's on the go over the legal side?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to ask this. Let me tell you what the situation is. Well, first of all, Cloudy and Aguma were out. Right, we dismissed Cloudy, and Aguma, the CEO, resigned in the middle of the dismissal process. We have now gone to court to block their pensions and to recover money from them. So Cloudy's 11 million bonus and these other issues, and that money keeps growing, by the way, because as you find more things, they can be added in. Okay. Now this is the disappointing part. When we want to go, we've done some of our own investigations, but when you want to take action, criminal action, or even civil action, in the SAEs, you're required to go through the SIU, the Special Investigative Unit. The Special Investigative Unit, I'm not going to say it's captured. You can make your own judgments, but they charge us millions of rands for doing the investigation. They've got quite a broad range of issues, and we're waiting to see. That's how it's done. Pretty much. And but you know, I've said, I spoke to David Lewis, you know, the Corruption Watch, and I said, David, how do I get a prosecution? Can you tell me what to do? He said, no, I can't. And I think, I've spoken to several other people whose names you'd recognize. If the NPA and the SIU and, you know, the basic institutions don't do their job, and the police don't do their job, it's hard. There is also the other thing. I mean, look, you know, the big question always is how fast should we move? My instinct is to move much faster than we have. My colleagues tend to restrain me, and they may not be entirely wrong. I think they're at least partly wrong. Yeah, it's hard to get people actually charged and dismissed, but you will definitely see that this year. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the question was, how will Cyril manage Ace Magashulu and David Mabuza? I think they're, he's got as president and the chair of the party on his side. And a third one, the NEC, of course, is split 3-3, but I don't think it's equal when there's a president in the room. I think Cyril, he's had so much experience of this. I meant to say, unlike Donald Trump, he's a good negotiator. He's really got so much experience of this as Secretary General, in the unions, the business, and in politics. I think Ace will be working both sides for sure. Mabuza is playing. I suppose the real question is, if charges come up against either of those people, what will Cyril do? Because both Mbeki and Zuma protected people from charges. I don't think Cyril would do it, but if it's that high level, who knows? I don't think he would do it, but I don't know for sure. Oh, yes.
You've taken the SABC as one SO.
Yes.
From what you said, it's really the board that plays the decisive role. How optimistic are you about changes to the boards of the other SOs to be able to bring about the kind of transformation that we're looking for? Take Gaza. There's something that was announced by SAA cutting something like but I mean, the other
Thanks. It all depends on Parliament. It may be harder because Parliament had a bigger role in the SABC because they chose the board members. It's going to depend on who chooses the board members. If Cyril is dominating in the choice, I think he can do it. I think that's the answer. And of course. No, that's clear as daylight. It all depends who chooses. I mean, if you go through the minutes of the boards that, well, look, I don't want to pretend to know more than I know. I mean, Cyril is playing his cards close to his chest. He's going to start changing the chess, the pawns and bishops on the table. I just don't know how long he'll take over each one. But if he, just to finish your question, if they choose to put the right people in, they can change them all. Sorry, there were some new people. Yeah.
When will the ESCOM inquiry resume?
Well, I assume it was stopped because of all the politics that was going on. So I assume it'll resume in the next couple of weeks. Yeah.
The SABC inquiry was riveted.
It was. And
But may I quickly grab another couple of questions?
sure.
Bearing in mind that people acknowledge, express that South Africa cannot afford a nuclear deal.
Yeah.
But he wants Mhlobo to be kept, he wants Bongo to be kept. He's still trying desperately to structure it.
Yeah.
Can we be sure that that is not entirely true?
No, I think he's going to stop the nuclear deal.
You think he will?
I think he will stop it. Funnily enough, I think that Nkosazana would have too. Zuma will try till the day he's stopped, but I think that Cyril will. I think they'll stop it. It's just so obviously inappropriate. Sorry, there were one or two new questions. Yes. The question is, what will happen to the EFF? I suppose that depends. You know, they're very clever young people who are getting a lot of education and evolving. They're growing and changing their views and getting smarter and more sophisticated. But I think they're in a bit of a difficult position right now. The ANC has agreed to their main demand, which is land confiscation, even though they're not going to implement it, but neither would the EFF probably. So I think they did badly in the elections in 2016. They grew from 6% to 8%. That was much less than was. I mean, that's good going for a new party, but it was much less than they predicted, and much less than they predicted or many others predicted. So I think they're now in the hard road, and I think if Cyril operates effectively, everybody's going to be under pressure. Sorry, it was you.
I think it's off topic, but do you know the story behind all these poisoning things, and why do they go to Russia to treat the poisoning of David Makuza, and he even drew attention to it at the conference. What's that about? You want to chance?
No, I wish I had such secret knowledge about the poisonings. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that Mandela always knew where the best doctors in Johannesburg were, or Cape Town. These guys go to Russia for their medical treatment. Sorry. No, hold on. Yeah, let me take some new ones.
I think many South Africans are doubtful about Cyril because he didn't open his mouth while Zuma was stealing this country. And there is that doubt.
Yes.